She was unflaggingly rude to waiters, cab drivers, hotel clerks. After she was recognised by Cash, we were dining where we bought some sandwiches. Her displeasure was completely egregious. He only knew who I was because he saw me on television. She was rude. Unlike most writers, Susan was a celebrity. She was famous, of course, but her hair was a celebrity. Perilously, she cultivated sycophants. She encouraged them. They were useful to her. They gladly would have walked 20 miles to fetch her a can of Bistella if she'd asked them to. Nobody shot her outside the Dakota, thank God. And having met some of her ex-admirers, I'm surprised nobody tried. She got her friends confused with her adorers, with predictably negative consequences. In my case, copying amphetamines for her over many years probably encouraged the sporadic delusion that I was on call. I often had to remind her that I hung out with her because it was fun to talk with someone who'd read all the books I had, someone to go to the movies with, go dancing with, take drugs. I didn't want career help. I didn't want to go to cocktail parties. I didn't want to publish in the New York Review of Books. I didn't want to meet her Nobel Prize-winning friends or sit on panels or any of it. Sometimes she forgot. She had so many people eager to form. I was going to say something, and I'm going to kind of hold it back, I think, about all of the consequences of what happened at 9/11. I can't hold it back and tell you, it's where I wind up. But you may know that she wrote an article by an extraordinary coincidence, and pathos really. This New Yorker was in Berlin when 9/11 took place. She had no television in her apartment in America. Typical Americans, snobbish, crazy America. She had no television. This woman, the great critic of photographic media, she watched TV in Europe. So she watched the thing for 48 hours, like everybody did on CNN, around the clock, on the telephone. And what's, as most people really love New York, on the telephone that day, she could get through to people. And of course, she wrote an article about the grotesque, awful rhetoric of the commentators appearing. The rhetoric surrounding the representation of AIDS on television for the first 48 hours. And she wrote a 3-paragraph piece for the New Yorker, stunning, amazing, piece of amazing acuity, honest, sincere, not for a moment dismissing the horror of the enormity of what had happened, but recoiling, as she so clearly always did, at the downside of America, of self-deception and sentimentality. People telling us endlessly how they were feeling about what was going on. And she was really crucified for that. She must have known she would be crucified. She was really badly attacked, meanly attacked. People hated her as well. You need to remember, when she died, the obituaries were mainly churlish. Some of them were actually grotesquely horrible, but that's a whole other story. 3 weeks later, she was interviewed by an Italian journalist, and that interview is also published in the posthumous collection, edited and put together by his son. A piece called Just a Few Weeks Later. A few weeks after. It's a fabulous, fabulous, fabulous interview. I've been a fervent critic of my country for almost as long as Gore Vidal, although I hope with more accuracy. And take for granted that questioning US foreign policy is always desirable, as is inevitable. That being said, I don't believe that Roosevelt, as Gore Vidal claimed, provoked the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The Japanese government really was committed to the folly of starting a war with the United States. Neither do I think that America has been provoking the Islamic war for years. America has behaved brutally, imperially, in many countries, but it is not engaged in any overall operation against something that can be called the Islamic world. For all that I deplore about American foreign policy and American imperial presumption and arrogance, the first thing to keep in mind is that what happened on September 11th was an appalling crime. But it's a very, very fabulous interview and should be read with equally fabulous New Yorker article on the grotesque photographs of the torture victims at Abu Ghraib, which again is one. She got better and better, but then she knew she didn't know long to live. Ghastly, ghastly to say, but I think probably what that, you know, that's the long and short of it. She was getting iller and iller. Having fought cancer twice over long periods of time, she came down with leukemia. I only ever met her myself on one occasion. It was the London launch. Can we take some more pictures? I'm sorry.
Oh, yes.
Let's grow Susan Sontag up a bit. The famous Susan Sontag with the chinchilla. The chinchilla look, which was also Diaghilev's look, remember? Sergei Diaghilev was the other great 20th century figure at the other end of the century with the chinchilla streak, but never mind. I only ever met her myself on one occasion. It was at the London launch of a hardback edition of the story that I spoke about earlier in this talk, The Way We Live Now. It had been published as a hardback, or republished, with illustrations by Howard Hodgkins, as a fundraiser for AIDS charities in America and the UK. This struck me as doubly inappropriate, not that it was a fundraiser, but that Howard Hodgkins should be doing the illustrations, partly because I rather dislike his work, or I never liked it. His recent retrospective made me dislike it very actively indeed, a much later perception. But also because he was such a closet queen. You know, if ever there was a closet queen in the universe, it was Howard Hodgkins. Like, for God's sake, you could have got some, even David Hockney, somebody who was out, somebody said something specific politically in that context. By this time, it was 1991 for God's sake. The death rate was appalling. I mean, 88 was bad enough. By 1991, AIDS was unspeakably horrible. To have this creepy, nasty little man doing this stuff. Actually, I can show you some illustrations. Can we fast forward there? That's a lovely picture. But yeah, thank you. This is one of the illustrations of The Way We Live Now. This wonderful, extraordinary story about life in New York and the epidemic. Oh no, sorry. Try again. For someone like me in 1991, I've been working in AIDS now for 7 years. I'd done my training in Gateway's Health Crisis back in '83. It really wasn't acceptable to have Howard Hodgkins do stupid illustrations for a wonderful, wonderful story. Also, other things were happening. The activist movement was well underway. ACT UP was going around fury for several years ago. I was organising photography groups as well as running the Terence Higgins Trust prevention work. I was overwhelmed. I was really too overwhelmed, of course. So it wasn't the best of time to meet Susan Sontag. Can I have the next slide, please? Yes. And the next one, please. I was also trying to get Felix Gonzalez-Torres, who'd been a student of mine in New York years before, show him that I'd failed. I was writing about his work. I was really kind of involved with David Ronovovich, who was also an old friend of mine. These were people I knew at my age, and often younger. Felix was a lot younger than me. David Ronovovich, for God's sake, was 5 years younger than me. I sometimes forgot that because he looked a lot older, but he had a hard life on the streets, for Christ's sake. They were my friends, and I kind of, Susan Sontag's book on AIDS had annoyed me, and it was a bad time to try and meet her. So anyway, I went over, and I gratefully shook her hand, and I said something like, "It's an honour to meet you," and it was a real honour for me to meet her. I admired her greatly. But I really regret now, sitting here today, the fact that I never had the opportunity to just sit down, actually, like you can sometimes with somebody, just have a chat, and talk through some of these issues that this lecture has inadequately tried to put out on the table. The critics who with whom you battle in your head. In a moving obituary in the Village Voice, which again is included in his recent collection of essays, Gary Indiana writes, and this is where I'm going to end, because he can write with the authority of real friendship. She was the indispensable voice of moral responsibility, perceptual clarity, passionate and passionately reasonable advocacy for aesthetic pleasure, for social justice, for unembarrassed hedonism, for life against death. I like the reference to Norma Brown included there. Again, a forgotten figure, but in the late 60s, and she wrote about Norma Brown in an important essay against interpretation, a certain kind of American socialist incorporation of Freud. Can I have the next slide, please? I'll go whiz past Felix Gonzalez-Torres. I'm sorry, Felix, but onto Annie Leibovitz, last couple of pictures of Susan Sontag. Sontag took it as a given that our duty as sentient beings is to rescue the world. She knew that empathy can change history. She set the bar of skepticism as high as it could go. Allergic to received ideas and their hypnotic blandishments, she was often startled to discover how devalued the ethical sense and the courage to exercise it had become in American consumer culture. Sontag drew on her better than well-informed conclusions about what happened on 9/11. The habit of independent thought has so little currency in 21st century America that dissent is the last thing most Americans consider worth protecting. Sontag's political lapses, cited even in sympathetic articles, are in fact the public moments one should most admire her for. She was usually right, and when she hadn't been, she said so. It's customary these days to damn people for his inconsistency, as if it's somehow virtuous to persist forever in being wrong. Sontag interrogated her own ideas with merciless rigour, and when she discovered they no longer applied, or were effectively inadequate, or just plain bad, she never hesitated to change her mind. There's no way to summarise her restless cultural itinerary and her immense services to the Republic of Letters in the space of an obituary. What I can speak of here again is the indelible example she set as a moral being, citizen and writer. She sedulously distinguished between the merely personal and the insights personal experience generated. I appears less frequently in her writings than in those of any other significant American writer I can think of. If Sontag was less averse in recent terms to saying I, it could be that she had last realised she'd earned the authority for I to mean more coming from her than it does coming from most people. I once heard her say, I never heard her say a dumb word, even in moments of evident distress. She did from time to time do things that seemed quite hard, but then who doesn't? Her will to keep experiencing, learning and feeling the old emotions, and sometimes to make herself empty, restock her interiority, break with old ideas,